Hello and welcome to our Q&A hangout with Mr. Mark Waid. Mark, thank you for being with us here today.
My pleasure, sir.
For any of you that are not familiar, Mark Waid is the award-winning writer of numerous comics properties, from Fantastic Four, Legion of Superheroes, Captain America, currently the all-new, all-different Avengers, and we'll be talking largely today about his 4-year run on Daredevil with artist Chris Samnee. Again, wonderful to have you here, Mark, and thank you for being willing to talk about this specific subject that we've been looking at all throughout the course of this semester, the depiction of cancer in comic books. Now, just as a bit of background, I should say that the students that I've been working with, they've been looking at a number of autobiographical works. Harvey Picar's Our Cancer Year. They've looked at Cancer Vixen. They've also looked at Cancer Made Me a Shallower Person, and the one superheroic title that was assigned to them was Jim Starlin's The Death of Captain Marvel.
Makes
However,
sense.
I asked them to explore some other works, and a number of them were drawn to the much enjoyable run on Daredevil, specifically Volume 3, where you reveal that Daredevil, Matt Murdock's closest ally, his law partner, Foggy Nelson, in fact, has cancer.
Right.
Now, in one of your interviews with Marvel.com, you mentioned that the genesis of the idea of Foggy's cancer came from Marvel publisher Dan Buckley, that at first you resisted. While you warmed to the idea of taking Matt and Foggy's relationship somewhere new, what did it tap into for you personally? Have you had to experience a loved one go through anything similar?
I have, although that really wasn't the genesis of my resistance. We'll get to the first part of that in a minute. But in terms of the resistance, it had less to do with scaring up personal demons and more to do with my gut feeling being that I didn't want to write a cancer story that led to death, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's not a very hopeful, optimistic way to go. It's not a story of triumph that way, which I think superhero stories are sort of built to deliver. And beyond that, I'm very protective of characters who have been around longer than I have. You know, I'm very protective of characters who predate me. I don't want to be the guy who killed Foggy Nelson, because there's no way to put that genie back in the bottle once you've done that. You know, I think that's, again, I just didn't want to be the guy to if that's where you wanted to go, you know, with you know, the termination of Foggy's life, then I couldn't go there. What worked for me and what made it seem workable for us as a creative team was, and there was no resistance to this, but once I posited it as, can this be a story of triumph? Can this be a story where Foggy ends up in remission, but there is always that hanging over him, but nonetheless it is a story of triumphing over the odds rather than just succumbing to another dark, bleak, horrible thing to happen to Matt Murdock and his cast. And everybody at Marvel was fine with that, and I think that's what we got out of it. And that's what gave me the courage to tell the story, is I knew in the end that I wasn't going to be the guy to kill Foggy Nelson.
Okay, that's fair, and in fact, it ties into a related question I had. I did wonder if Foggy's fate was determined from the outset.
Yes.
Or if they're, okay. Because I had to think about that, even though Daredevil, Matt Murdock, had experienced a great deal of loss in his life. Most of the loss he experienced, from a dead father to 2 dead girlfriends, were sudden and violent. And here instead you have Foggy dying from something gradually, dying by inches.
Right, by inches, exactly. Yeah, the insidious nature of cancer, right.
I had to wonder if the prospect of Foggy's death, even if it was really a narrative reality for you, ultimately, did the prospect of losing Foggy, when you thought about Matt's psychology, do you think it would have impacted him differently than the other losses he's endured and survived?
Yeah, I think it would have on several levels. One being that Matt would have been devastated, but at the same time, Matt is reasonable enough a human being to know that this was not his fault. Whereas he bears some, he can always look at the other deaths and think to himself, if I'd only done this, if I'd only done this, maybe it would have been different. It probably wouldn't have, but that's Matt's nature, to be very self-reflective in that sense. Whereas there's nothing, there's nothing he could have done here. So I think, but it still would have been devastating because it's his best friend. It's been his best friend for a long time. Foggy has. I think that, like I said, if we going back to something I said earlier, which again, I apologize for veering off track, but I didn't answer the first part of your question earlier, which is that, yeah, I've been through this myself. My mother in '96, I guess, was diagnosed with cancer of the lymph nodes. She'd smoked like a chemical factory all her entire life, and it caught up with her at age 52, I guess, 53. Wow, I'm older than my mother now when she passed away. Um, and so she was diagnosed, and then the final passing away happened pretty quickly. And I want to say it was less than a year. And during that time, I cared for her. I moved down to Mississippi to be with her for a while, and watched that happen, and dealt with doctors, and dealt with treatment, and dealt with, and again, this is not a poor pitiful me story at all. It's not about me, it's about my mom. But it
No,
gave me
no.
the insight, obviously, to deal with it, and to express through Foggy some of the conversations I had with her about how it was impacting her.
In fact, that rings a bell, because I believe when Jim Starlin did his own superhero cancer story, Death of
Right.
Captain Marvel, his father either was dying or had recently died
I believe that's
of
correct. Yeah.
cancer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it became as much maybe a process or a meditation on this sort of illness through the lens of the superhero. I will say, though, one thing that distinguishes the Death of Captain Marvel from your storyline with Daredevil, beyond Foggy surviving, is that with Death of Captain Marvel, Starlin seems quite critical, quite angry. And he puts this in the mouth of a number of characters, saying that all these superheroes and super geniuses should bear some guilt or responsibility for not putting their powers and their collective brilliance
Right.
behind solving cancer. Now, even though you have characters like Hank Pym and Stephen Strange show up during the storyline, they seem much more sympathetic, or they seem to commiserate
Right.
with Matt and Foggy in their limitations. Could you speak to if that was a conscious choice, and why you wanted them to read that way?
Well, because I don't think that superhero stories are set up to answer big questions like, why don't we fix world hunger, or why don't we wipe out cancer or diabetes or whatever. It, I appreciate where Starlin was coming from, and I think some of that, as you said, it was more cathartic for him in the moment than it was for me, where it was a little more reflective. But it is such, we were talking about this weekend, it's just at a convention, it was just slippery slope to start asking the questions of, okay, if Mr. Fantastic can build an anti-gravity car, how is it that all the ambulances in New York don't also have anti-gravity? Wouldn't that make sense that that would happen? That you would do that? Why, if Tony Stark can build all this cool stuff, why isn't the American military, why don't they all have Iron Man suits? And the only, no matter how you march down that road, the answer is ultimately it's comics. You know, it's superhero comics, and they're not built to resolve questions like that. We fake answers. You know, we'll do stories that sort of skirt up against it, but then there'll always be somebody who says, well, you know, I can bend steel with my bare hands, and but cancer is beyond me. And I'd rather just not even go that route. Everybody knows that. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, which is comic book superheroes can't cure cancer. Anybody who's never read a comic book knows that.
And I think you actually admit that in some way. You you did a backup story in Daredevil 26.
Right, which I was very proud of. And Chris Samnee again hit it out of the park with that. Yeah. And that's about the one thing that superheroes can do when they can't cure cancer, but what they can do is they can sort of inflame the spirit of hope, the positive attitude that is necessary to this. I read a book years ago called The Survivors Club. Do you know this book?
I don't know.
It's really interesting. It's 5 or 6 years ago, if not longer. It's a really interesting study that the writer made over years and years. He was looking for a common thread. He talked to cancer survivors, people who survived kidnappings, people who survived train wrecks, people who survived plane crashes, people who survived, you know, any number of life-threatening scenarios, looking for the common thread, to see if there was some X factor where some people survived and some didn't, and what that was. And what he basically found, and this should come as no real surprise, but it was interesting to see it articulated and sort of, you know, codified this way, is that it all came down to positive attitude. It all came down to faith and believing in something, not necessarily a Judeo-Christian faith, not necessarily a spiritual faith even. Sometimes just the faith in the brotherhood of man, or the faith that we are all part of some bigger picture or something. But that was the X factor. That was the key. And superheroes play into that beautifully. Superheroes are a symbol of that idea that, you know, we are part of something bigger than us, and that there is hope and optimism that is a key factor in fighting battles.
Yeah, and in the story that we referenced, you called it Punching Cancer.
Right, yeah.
You actually have Foggy go down to a children's cancer ward. They're creating all sorts of stories about superheroes physically taking on cancer. And when he freaks out and worries that, oh my God, they're going to be so disillusioned, they're going to be so shattered, they're the ones that say, no, this is just a comic book. And the doctor explains that it's there for therapeutic reasons, for inspiring them, giving them a fighting chance.
Right. I mean, really, where that story came from was this idea that it was a way of walking up to this question of, why don't superheroes solve the world's ills? And the answer is because even a child knows the difference between fantasy and reality, and knows that superheroes can't really do that. That's not what they're built for.
Yeah, I will say that the only, and this is by no means a critique, this is just an observation as I was doing, the only part at which, given my focus on superheroes and the afterlife and death and rebirth and resurrection, the only moment I had to check my suspension of disbelief again was when Elektra showed up. Now, Elektra was one of the girlfriends that Matt had mourned. She was brought back from the dead. So when you had him consulting with one rebirthed, reborn, resurrected character about how to help a dying character, that's the only point at which I said, this is a dangerous or difficult.
Yes, that's very
high wire act. Yeah,
and in retrospect, I think I wish I'd hit that nail a little more heavily on the head. That's actually a good point. Yeah,
you don't avoid it. I mean, you don't.
Right, but I could have gotten more out of it, which is interesting. In retrospect, and I think that was just a matter of space and time, just having to, you know, I knew at that point also we were running up to the end of our run on that book, so there were many other things to put in order. Yeah.
Now, this leads to one other question. Much later in the series, this is when you're in the next volume of Daredevil,
Right.
Hank Pym attempts to help Foggy by shrinking down and eliminating circulating tumor cells, CTCs, at the cellular level. Now, Matt admits that it's a colossally hit and miss project,
Right.
but it's one of the few times that the fantastic enters into Foggy's real life treatment, or resembling real life treatment. Admittedly, it doesn't seem to cure Foggy, so it's not a deus ex machina that you threw in there. But did you have any misgivings or a revised approach in most fully merging the superheroic and the fantastic into Foggy's realistic cancer fight?
Oh, no, because actually I think that was the point I was trying to hit, was that I was trying to find that compromise. I was trying to find that idea that, okay, just because they can't do anything doesn't mean they wouldn't try to do something. So it was a way of, I was actually very proud of that bit, because it felt to me like it wasn't a failure. It felt to me like it was neither a success nor failure, but it was a genuine, honest effort. And I did the heavy research, obviously, about CTC cells and what an incredible roll of the dice it is to try to wipe that at a microscopic level. So yeah, Hank Pym does his best, and there's probably even a bit of remission, that that tiny little fractional bit of remission that this resulted in, but it was such a small piece of the overall problem.
Tell me about the research you had to do for this. I don't doubt that with any of your writing projects, you have to do research, of
Right.
course, but diving into oncology and treatments, and specifically Ewing sarcoma,
Right.
did this prove a new challenge or something unique?
It was certainly, I mean, again, like I said, research is always a part of what you do. I mean, it for people who aren't regular readers of superhero comics, you might be surprised at the fact that even though they're stories about people who can lift buses over their heads and fly through the air, that even with that suspension of disbelief, there is an attempt to uh, ground in reality to some degree. So there's always research if you're doing it right, because you want it to have verisimilitude, right? You want it to have at least a semblance of the world outside your window. So yeah,
Right.
I dove very heavily into cancer research, looking specifically for something that would give me the symptoms that I needed to tell the story, that would make the most logical sense for Foggy, who is not a smoker, who is not who doesn't really show any of the outside exposure uh, signals, the red flags, like smokers or whatever. Doesn't seem genetically predisposed to it. So I was looking for that. I was looking for something that would give me the time frame I needed to tell that story. Something, Ewing sarcoma is something that uh, made sense from what we know about it, but it also is not necessarily as fast acting as, say, more, lymph
Sure.
node or something else. And I also had to, it was interesting, I also filtered it through Matt Murdock's own abilities and his own hypersenses, because Matt's Daredevil's shtick is that he is blind, but he has super enhanced senses that help him compensate. And getting into it, doing research about cancer sniffing dogs,
Mhm.
that sort of thing, I was really sort of taken with this idea of, how does Matt perceive this? How do Matt's other senses pick up on the cancer and the treatment? How do they react to the cancer and the treatment?
And even in the autobiographical graphic novels that we read over the course of the semester, there's frequently mention of the distinct smell, the
Right.
distinct medical or sterile smell to a chemotherapy ward.
Yeah.
And you had to amplify that. You had to filter that through Matt's super senses.
Right.
You took great advantage of that.
You'd obviously be hypersensitive to that, and so I'm I think it made heroes out of both men. That a hero of Foggy for fighting the cancer, and a hero to Matt, a hero for making a hero of Matt by having him. I was very proud of the scene where he goes into Foggy's room and he's just overwhelmed by the stench of the chemicals and the chemotherapy, more so than any human being would be, because again, of the super hyper senses that Matt can smell, perfume from 100 yards away. So I was very proud of the fact that he puts on the brave face, he leaves the room, he goes into the men's room, he vomits, gets it out of his system, and then he comes back in his room and he puts on his game face again, and he's just going to be there for Foggy, and he's not going to let Foggy know how much it's affecting him.
Vomiting has to be particularly horrible for Daredevil.
Oh my God, yeah. The Daredevil.
It must be even worse.
It's got to be much worse for him. I think about that a lot. When I think about Daredevil, I always thought about every aspect of how life would be for him. I was very careful to write a scene where he was, the joke was that the strongest spice in his kitchen is salt, because he hates spicy foods, because why would he would everything to him is a spice. Little things like that. Boy, vomiting if you're Daredevil, and nobody likes it, but oh my God, yeah.
Well, at the time we're recording this, Netflix just released the second season of Daredevil. Yeah, just released the second season of Daredevil, and I couldn't help but think, as I'm watching one of these scenes, this is not giving anything away, that, geez, is sex pleasant for Matt Murdock when all of his senses are every drop of sweat is smelled or absorbed. He just must live a totally different biological life.
He must, and I would think that it would be incredibly pleasurable for him, because that's one of those things where you'd have to make a choice. You'd have to choose whether or not to let it be negative or let it be positive for you, because it's just there. So you would simply have to choose to embrace it and lean into it.
Go ahead. I will leave that where that is.
Yeah.
I want to go back to your comment earlier, how carefully you chose Ewing sarcoma, which I think my students really seized upon. Now, let me just put this in context. Again, in a number of the autobiographical and biographical works we read, Mom's Cancer, or Our Cancer Year, or The Story of My Tits, which just recently came out from Top Shelf. There's a lot of energy and time spent on thinking about how these cancers happened, right? What was the origin point to these cancers? And in many cases, they can never find out. They can never rewind the clock and find out. If my students cried foul on anything concerning Marvel, it was that he knew the exact moment, the instant, the battle with nitro to seal the nerve gas canister that years ago gave him that cancer. You didn't seem to fall into that trap. It didn't seem as though you were tempted to explain exactly what did Foggy in. Was that conscious and on your mind? Did that relate at all to your own mother's struggle, or did in your case, it originated with smoking?
Right. Well, we know, but we don't know, do we? I mean, we think we know, and we can make a pretty educated guess that it did, because one tends to lead to the other, but you never know. I mean, again, this is just as we were trying not to put a pat ending on Foggy's resolution with cancer. I was not interested in tying up the beginning of his cancer with a big bow either, saying, oh, look, the fight with the radioactive man obviously clearly gave Foggy cancer. That's not how things work in the real world. That's not, like you said, there's very rarely an origin moment to your cancer. It just is there.
Right. No, I thought that was really deft on your part.
Thank
and
you.
It was the moment that threw my student readers out momentarily, not
Yeah.
permanently, of the death of Captain Marvel.
Yeah, I
This
can see that.
exact moment. Okay, I'm gonna risk overreading for just one second.
Okay. Go. I love
Humor
these.
me
So go.
here.
All right.
This is what we do. Okay. Um, I wrote this down, so I want to make sure I got this right because this is complicated. As Foggy receives treatment, Matt continues on as Daredevil, first confronting Ikari, and later the alien Asian Ruach.
Mm-hmm.
Now, forgive my overreading here, but Ikari beats Matt nearly to death and says, quote, "Now you will know how your life will end. What we don't want you to know is when," close quote. I'm inclined to see this as a tangible supervillain version of Foggy's own fight. The cancer is killing him, and he fears it's only a matter of time. It's cancer's timetable, much as it is Ikari's.
Right.
What would your verdict be? Overread or?
No, on the money. That was something that
Yeah, right.
exactly. We backed into it, but once I realized it was there, I remember sharpening that moment, that speech from Akari, with that in mind. So well done.
Okay, thank you. Look, I'm going to go 2 for 2 now. Let's see if this happens. Now, Ruach is pursued by the Silver Surfer, who is challenged in catching him because Asians, as Matt describes it, quote, "have no souls." That makes Ruach uniquely invisible to the Surfer, who sees people based on things more than sight, sees them based on their inner light and
Right.
their biological function, so forth. Okay. Since Ruach is Hebrew for the word soul or inner light, and we just brought up this idea that perhaps he has no soul, were
Right.
you inviting thoughts of Foggy's death and afterlife by means of this conflict?
Wow, that one you may have overreached on, but
All
but
right.
I would love to take credit for that. I would love to, if I were an arrogant prick, I would be sitting here going, "Oh yes, you're on to me." But aren't I a genius? But honestly, that was no, that wasn't on my mind.
It was
The
only subconscious. It wasn't
Right.
conscious. It was just,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was exactly. I honestly, this is the God's honest truth. It's something that Grant Morrison and I talk about all the time. Is that I honestly believe that if you're in the game, and if you're doing this serial adventure stuff on a regular basis, and you're really invested in it, then whether you realize it or not, you're leaving breadcrumbs for yourself. That you are setting up things on a subconscious level that you as a writer are not necessarily aware of on a conscious level. And that kind of goes back to Mark Twain's old adage, right, about how theme is something that the reader brings to the work, not something that the writer invests in the work. Theme is what happens when it's all done, and somebody else looks at it. But yeah,
Oh,
I
I know
wish.
any number. I know any number of scholars that will discount whatever the author ever said about his or her work and
Right,
say, no, this reading is there and therefore it is valid. And if
right,
it's strong enough a misreading, strong enough to like topple the edible poet, then it sticks.
right.
But I did want to go directly to the source, directly to the horse's mouth on that one. Okay.
Good, but good thought. Yes, Ruach. I do remember Ruach being exactly that, going through looking for the right words, the right syllables, the right, naming things in comics, naming characters in comics is a real black art. There's no science to it. You're just sort of looking for something that is suggestive without being on the nose. If I may break my arm patting myself on the back for a moment, I am especially proud of the name Akari, because I went through a bunch of different Japanese words looking for the right one, and I settled on 2 or 3 that sort of meant the same thing. But if you'll notice about the word Akari, it has 2 eyes.
Very nice. Oh,
Thank you.
that's a nice
Thank
that's a
you.
nice pictophonic pun right there. Well, I
Thank you.
liked Ikari because it meant fury and
Yep.
it looked vaguely like the Daredevil symbol, but you're
Right.
saying
We
pun through it and you
pun through
have
it, and it
a
has
sighted
2
Daredevil.
eyes. Exactly. Yes.
Very nice.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I won't. I'll feel better about my overreads in the future. Okay. Let me bring up just one slightly tangential point, but I think it can apply to our works overall here. You mentioned Grant Morrison, and we've read his Super Gods in the past, and he has, in various interviews and writings, suggested that storytellers, narrators, even magicians, are tapping into something larger with their stories. Now, you didn't necessarily say that just now. I'm not ascribing that to you. You
Right.
were suggesting it's more your subconscious. But there is a line of thought in religious studies, in the works of scholar Jeffrey Kripal, the idea that, yes, this is what storytellers do. The good ones, the ones that resonate, do so because they are speaking to something that we're sharing.
Yes.
Has your conversation with Grant Morrison or others ever taken it that far?
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, I think Grant perceives sort of a tapestry that I or most other mortals do not, because he's so smart and so plugged in, and he's especially into that. But I would absolutely agree. I mean, that's what makes stories timeless, right? The good stories that last the test of time, they're addressing universal concerns. They're addressing universal truths. They are speaking to a world beyond the keyboard and a world beyond the book, but a world beyond the printed word. That's what good stories do. And again, we get back to the function of superheroes as a genre. I mean, they are built to do that. They are built to be engines of imagination, right? And engines of possibility. And that they have a unique ability, I think, to open that window to again, not only a world beyond us, but a world that we are all a part of, a world that we are all connected by. There is when I was writing Superman Birthright, which was the sort of the definitive 21st century retelling of Superman's origin, I came across, not just one quote, but a whole litany of philosophy that to have special abilities, but to hide them under a bushel, to hide your light under a bushel is a sin against man. Essentially, it's a sin against the brotherhood of man. That if you want to be truly connected with the world, if you want to truly embrace the world around you, then be who you are. Be everything you are to the best of your abilities. And
yes,
and so that, again, that speaks very much to what superheroes do. And again, so I think there's something there to the idea that they're a great vehicle to sort of bind us together.
Forgive one more sort of offshoot thought here, but
Sure.
one of the other series that you're currently helming, I'll get to all new, all different Avengers in just a
Right.
second, but you're also doing Archie
Yeah.
comic right now. You seem to have, and both in practice and in speaking here, a superb grasp of what the superhero genre itself can do, what it's constructed for. If you had to tackle any sort of similar storyline, a cancer storyline, an illness storyline in an Archie comic,
Wow.
what is that genre built to do that might take such a concern in a different direction?
That's an interesting question. I think that I think there's room for it to be a little more fatalistic in an Archie comic, which sounds paradoxical on the face of it, because when most people think about Archie comics, they think about goofy humor, and that is a
Right.
huge part of Archie comics. But what we seem to have tapped into with Archie now that seems to resonate is, while it is still fundamentally a humor book, there's a great deal of drama in it as well. And that comes from, we get back to the issue of what is universal, right? Let's get back to the issue of how a 54-year-old man can write 17-year-old teenagers relatively convincingly, which I
Quite
Apparently
convincing.
I can.
Quite convincing.
But I think the secret to that, and I've said this before, the secret to that is not worrying so much about the year 2016, not worrying so much about what fashion, what fads, what language, what slang is contemporary in the moment, and instead focusing on the emotions that are constant, the emotions that were true for me as a high school student, the emotions that were true for you as a high school student, the idea that that looking foolish in front of your classmates is the worst thing that can happen. The first kiss is the best thing that can happen. The idea that everyone's life, when you're a teenager, your life is high opera every day, right? And the fat lady sings every day.
So I like
So
that. So
yeah.
you could ramp up the drama here, the high operatics, high
Yes,
opera of Jughead's life versus whatever other character is enduring cancer,
right.
or has a loved one enduring cancer. You could focus on the relative drama of that rather than having to move Foggy's arc into inspiration or uplift.
Right, exactly. Because like I say, superheroes are not. No one really fundamentally wants to read a superhero story where the superhero fails. You can do that on occasion, obviously, but they're not. Life of the Death of Captain Marvel was a very well written, very well crafted piece of work. But you
It
wouldn't
certainly
want to.
was. And my comments about it earlier do not detract from that
No,
at all.
no. But what makes that sui generis, right? What makes that a unique piece of work is that it was a unique piece of work.
Mhm,
I would posit that works as the exception rather than the rule. The rule being
mhm.
superheroes are not built for those kind of stories, where 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 they are helpless. Superheroes are not built for stories where they are helpless. Um, Archie characters and characters that aren't superheroes have more flexibility there. So
Do you
yeah, it
also
would allow
suggest?
me. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I do have to say you mentioned having to speed things up because the series winding and being restarted. I remember you're mentioning that it is worth pointing out Marvel could experiment as Marvel's first build graphic novel. So
Right.
if there was any place to toss out that exception, it was there. It
Right.
was in this relatively new format for them and this higher price point.
Right.
Okay, I want to make sure we fast forward to the present
Okay.
and talk briefly about your current run on All New, All Different Avengers. Specifically, um, on your roster is the female Thor,
Right.
Jane Foster, every bit the old Thunder Gods equal, except that her human form is all too mortal as she fights breast cancer. Now, of course, in writing Avengers, you're utilizing characters that other writers are also exploring monthly in their own titles.
Right.
G. Willow Wilson with Ms. Marvel, Brian Michael Bendis with International Iron Man and Spider-Man and so forth. With Jason Aaron writing Jane's adventures in Thor, how do you and he negotiate Jane's portrayal? And specifically, has his depiction of her medical struggle impacted your own views on her portrayal?
Oh, fully. I mean, it was the entire thread of Jane Foster, Thor's alter ego, having cancer, was of Jason's invention, and I salute it. I think that's an interesting dichotomy between and especially the it's very Marvel in a way because the great Marvel formula for heroes is being a hero is a personal sacrifice, and in Jane's
Yes.
case, it is every time she reverts to Thor, every time she becomes Thor, it negates the effects of her chemotherapy. So it's always like back to square one with her, and that's the sacrifice she makes, which you know but neither can she just stay Thor all the time, because then as Jane she would be dying from the inside. There must be something that can be done. So it's that constant juggling of the two. um, as you say, if I'm writing Avengers, I don't own Thor in the sense, or own Jane Foster in the sense of being able to put that story further down the line. I can't really add to that's really further that line, because that's the Thor book's responsibility. But what I can do is focus on the relationships of the other people in the team to Jane Foster and the impossibility of her cancer, and the secrecy that she keeps about this. I mean, the big reveal recently was that no one on the team knows that she's Jane Foster. No one knows she has cancer. Captain America finds out purely by accident, and she's asked him, please keep this secret between us as I learn to deal with it. And he says to her, you know, I will support whatever. I think what you're doing is crazy in terms of continuing to be Thor, in terms of not letting other people in, but I respect your decision. It is your decision as to how to deal with this cancer. Just please be aware that if I think that it gets to a point where I can't support your decisions anymore, as your friend and your partner and your comrade, I will step in. Now, I don't know what that means. Again, this is the benefit of serial fiction. I get to make it up as I go. So I don't quite know yet, but that at least gives me some place to go with that storyline of cancer that Jason can't go, is again, how it relates to her other friends.
Right. No, and I think that's terrific. I'm keeping, in addition to enjoying the series itself, and one part of my mind, the other part of my mind is sort of tracking this progression and holding it up against all these other depictions of cancer in graphic novels and across the medium. Mark, I want to thank you so much for chatting with me today and for, frankly, addressing real-world concerns in your fantastic comics. And I mean that in both senses of the word.
You're very kind. Thank you.
I hope we get the chance to do this again, and I would indeed tell people to go out, purchase the current slate of comics being produced by Mark Waid, as well as an extensive back issue and run of back issues. I'm going to get you back here to talk about Hyper Time sometime.
Absolutely.
I fell in love with that.
I am totally game. I am totally fine with it. And absolutely, and again, once more, we get to extol the virtues of Grant Morrison while we do so. So that's fine too.
Oh yeah, I mean, it fits right into Multiversity for me. I won't hold you for that right now. Thank you once more, and say hello to Indiana for us.
Will do. Thank you again for everything, sir. Talk to you soon.